Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This will be Part 6, Chapter 6, entitled Up Down. The next morning, Izuku woke up with his alarm and he quickly silenced it, Zombie walking to the kitchen to make coffee. He froze in the doorway to the kitchen, catching sight of the coffee maker already percolating despite most definitely not being one of those that had a timer on it. How did you... Izuku whirled around with a yell, green lightning sparking along his arm. There was a burst of steam as muscular Yagi caught Izuku's arm, his hand closing around his wrist. Izuku gasped, eyes wide before filling with recognition. Yagi's eyes were full of mirth, and he was smiling. "Did you forget I was here, young Izuku?" he asked, releasing the boy's wrist and deflating. Izuku bit his lip and shrugged, turning away to pour himself some coffee. He was more awake now, but the original adrenaline was wearing off, and the exhaustion was seeping back into his body. "Best wake up, my boy," Yagi exclaimed, and Izuku resisted the urge to glare at him. He was not a morning person, and he was not used to people being near him during his waking up process. "The staff have a great day planned for 1A, Yagi continued. Izuku grumbled nonsensically to himself and grabbed the handle of the pot of coffee to finish pouring himself and Yagi a mug. He pushed Yagi's across the table to the man, who picked it up with a look of amusement. Izuku belatedly realized it was an old, cracked All Might mug. His own mug was from an old anime movie he had been obsessed with when he was a kid. Most of the things he had around here were almost as old as he was. He didn't really buy new things. "I don't have much food. Sorry," Izuku said flatly, before reaching into a cabinet to withdraw 2 of the jelly juice packets that he practically survived on. "It's quite all right," Yagi answered, and they sat down at the table for a moment. Izuku was fast, consuming the packet in less than a minute, then chugging half of his coffee, scalding his tongue. With the last half, he moved over to a drawer by the refrigerator that had all of his daily medicine in it. He gathered all of them and used the rest of the coffee to swallow the entire handful at once, ignoring the feeling of Yagi's eyes on his back. He knocked the rest of the coffee back and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand before glancing at Yagi. He took a lot of daily medication. There was his depression medicine, his anxiety medicine, his iron pills for anemia, and a couple others. He felt embarrassed by having his mentor see how much he had to take every morning, but he tried to ignore the feeling. "Shower," he said by way of explanation as he left, heading back to his room. He showered quickly, the heat waking him up and making him sleepy and dizzy at the same time as it always did. He could feel Yagi wandering around outside of the room, using the other bathroom and cleaning up. He finished quickly, dressing in front of his mirror and yet again struggling with the tie to his uniform. He did the best he could and walked out of his room yawning. Yagi was sitting on the couch when he walked out and looked up, a fond smile lighting across his features. He stood, approaching the boy, and Izuku had to resist the urge to back away. Yagi reached forward under Izuku's chin, and at first he was confused before he realized that the man was fixing his tie, and his cheeks heated up with a blush. "There, that's better." Izuku looked at his feet, rubbing the back of his head. "Thanks. We better get going," Izuku said. He didn't have his bag because it was still at school. Yagi followed him out the door and waited while Izuku locked it behind him. "Thank you," the boy repeated as they walked down the steps of the apartment complex. "Thank you for everything." The hero reached over and ruffled the boy's head. "It's no problem at all." They continued on after that in silence until, about halfway to the train, the ground shook with the vibrations of something quite large happening farther away. Izuku's head whipped up, as did Yagi's. A small scream penetrated the morning air. Yagi looked down at Izuku almost desperately. "Keep going. I'll take care of this," he said, and then he was gone, the wind he left ruffling Izuku's still drying hair. His curls always seemed to retain moisture for far longer than was really necessary in his eyes. Now alone, Izuku finished walking to the train. Izuku's headphones were stuck in his bag, which was sadly still at school, so Izuku took the train ride to scroll through his phone, watching the news articles pop up as All Might saved one person after the other, stopping multiple villains. He was going to run out of time, Izuku thought, with an audible sigh before pocketing his phone. The walk to the school was calm, and Izuku used the time to reflect on what had happened the day before. It had only been the second day, and already he had completely fallen apart in front of his homeroom teacher and ran away during an intense situation. This was definitely quite the high school. And then on top of that, there was everything that happened with Yagi. The panic attack, the crying, the hour-long disassociation in front of him. Izuku was so mad at himself. Why did he have to be like this? Why did he have to be so weak? Izuku was relieved to note that the gates of UA had been fixed, and that there were no reporters or camera people around, only 2 police cars parked near the entrance, probably to make sure that the same thing didn't happen again, and to dissuade people from mobbing the entrance and bothering all the students and teachers. Izuku walked through without any difficulty and headed up to the homeroom classroom, wondering how long the police would stay. He was not one of the first this time in the classroom. Uraraka and Ida were already there, practically jumping him when he walked through the door, radiating concern. Izuku brought his hands up placatingly. "I'm okay," he reassured breathlessly. "Where did you go yesterday, Midoriya? We were worried," Uraraka exclaimed. Izuku frowned. "They were?" He opened his mouth. "I don't like crowds." That was his lame response, as he pushed past them to sit at his seat, practically melting into it. Ida and Uraraka shared a look before glancing at their friend. Eventually they took their own seats right before Aizawa walked in, to stand behind the podium. He directed a look to Midoriya, but quickly looked back at the entirety of the class, leaving Izuku to wonder if he had imagined it. "For today's hero basic training, it's turned into a class with 3 instructors. All Might and me, and 1 more person," Aizawa began. Izuku wondered who the 3rd person could be. Maybe Vlad King if Class 1B was coming. Maybe it was a special class. From beside him, Sarah raised a hand, practically shouting his question, asking what they were doing. And Izuku winced at the loud voice in his ear. He could already feel a headache developing. "Disasters, shipwrecks, and everything in between," Aizawa explained, holding up a card that had "Rescue" written on it in bright blue lettering. "It's rescue training." The class was understandably excited about that. It was one of the biggest parts of being a hero, if not the biggest part. Saving people was at the very least largely important aspect of being a hero. Izuku wondered what the training would be like. "Hey, I'm not done," Aizawa interrupted the class's chattering. "You can decide if you want to wear your costume or not this time, because there are probably costumes that limit your abilities, too. The training will take place off campus, so we're taking a bus." Their teacher dismissed them after that, telling them to start getting ready and to meet outside. Izuku gathered his costume to change into. Luckily, it wasn't damaged from their first day, and it had been washed, though there were no more blood stains from where his head had tried to expel all the blood out of it through his nostrils and onto his shirt. Izuku tried to dress quickly, but was distracted by the feeling of someone watching him. When he turned, Todoroki was pointedly looking away from him. His aura was gray, flickering with embers of blue. When Izuku looked back away from him, the feeling of being watched immediately came back, and it was only then that he realized that he was currently shirtless, and all the scars on his arms and torso were bared for anyone and everyone in the locker room to see. And Todoroki was seeing them. Maybe they reminded him of his own burn scar over his eye. Izuku absently reached up to touch one on his ribcage when all of a sudden Kirishima bumped into him. "Hey, are you almost done? I'm so fired up for this. My hands are ready," he yelled. Izuku glanced back to see that Todoroki was gone. Izuku shook his head clear and quickly threw on the rest of his costume, heading out to join the others lining up for the bus. Izuku glanced at Todoroki as the class waited for the bus, most of them in small groups conversing with each other. The half-red, half-white-haired boy was sitting silently by himself on a bench. Izuku frowned. His fingers, now bared, crept up to his mouth, where he could bite on the nails. After a moment of hesitation, he walked over to the boy and sat down next to him without saying anything, the blue embers in his largely gray aura flickering in his vision. "You were watching me," he said, still chewing on his fingernails. Todoroki didn't deny it. "You have a lot of burn scars," he said, without any intonation in his voice. "Yeah," Izuku answered, grimacing, scratching at one on his arm with the hand that wasn't in his mouth. "You have a pretty large one yourself," he said quietly, and then winced, mentally kicking himself for saying such a dumb thing. Todoroki fingered the edge of the scar over his eye. "Yeah," the boy answered, and Izuku chewed his nails harder at the tense air he had caused between the two of them. He always did that. He always ruined any chance at friendship before it even started. Why couldn't he just... "You're bleeding." Todoroki's voice knocked Izuku out of his negative thoughts, and he glanced up to find the boy looking at him, his mismatched eyes level with his own. Izuku looked down at his right index finger and noticed the small rivulets of blood gathering along the skin by his now broken nail. "Shit," he growled, wrapping the abused finger in the fabric of his black jacket. "This always happens when I'm not wearing my gloves." "Is that why you wear gloves?" Todoroki asked, his voice friendlier this time. "It's part of it, I guess," Izuku shrugged, frowning. "But my quirk requires me to touch something with all 5 fingers, and sometimes it happens accidentally, so to avoid that I usually wear gloves." Todoroki appeared thoughtful for a minute. "I think that's the most I've heard you speak without stuttering." Izuku leaned back, eyes widening slightly. Oh, he stuttered, and then frowned. "Damn it." The corner of Todoroki's mouth quirked up in the largest display of emotion he had ever seen from the boy, and Izuku couldn't help himself from grinning at that because maybe there was a salvageable friendship after all. There was the sound of a whistle then, and Izuku flinched, eyes flashing upward. Todoroki caught his flinch but didn't say anything, as he too turned to see Ida, who was now yelling at the entire group of students. He was telling them all to get into 2 lines for the bus, but Izuku didn't think that the boy realized that it wasn't that kind of bus. It seemed the boy was really taking his class representative duties to heart, though. Izuku was glad that he had given him the title. After that, they were on the road heading to wherever their rescue training would be taking place. The bus had seats facing each other, and Izuku sat next to Sato and Asui and Kirishima, and in front of Ida, Ashido, Aoyama, and Kaminari. Izuku had been trying to listen out for people's names since class had started, and he felt he had already gotten a good grasp on everyone's. He was proud of that despite it already being several days into class. Ida moaned across from him, complaining about the bus not being what he had expected. Suddenly, next to him, Asui looked up at Izuku. "I usually say what comes to mind, Midoriya," she said, and Izuku didn't even notice his hand going up to his mouth, as his nerves spiked. "Yes, Asui?" he questioned, wondering what the heck she was getting at. "Call me Sue," she answered, and Izuku made a face. All right." He felt his teeth tug particularly hard at a nail, and he winced, now noticing what he was doing and burying his hands in the folds of his jacket. "Your quirk is like All Might's," she said, and Izuku inhaled sharply. But he was ready for this. He and All Might had discussed how to explain it away, if the situation called for it. Well, he scratched the back of his neck. "In a way, I suppose it is similar, but I only store ambient energy in my mindscape, though." He shook his head. "I don't have a surplus of it, so I'm not nearly as strong as All Might. I only use energy to enhance myself." "Wow!" Kirishima leaned forward at that. "It must be nice to have such a flashy quirk." And with that, the conversation was steered away from Izuku and toward what was expected of heroes, until all of a sudden Kacchan was yelling, causing Izuku to tense up and lean away toward Sato. And then something happened that Izuku had never seen before in his entire life of being around the explosive blonde. Kacchan was being teased. The bus began slowing down around that point, and at the front Aizawa stood, his hand closing around the partition between half of the front part and the back of the bus. "We're here. Stop messing around." A jolt of anxiety shot through Izuku's heart at that, like ice. He didn't know quite what to expect here, and that made him anxious. At least All Might would be with them, though. They filed off the bus and headed inside the huge building where none other than Pro Hero 13 awaited them. Izuku watched as Aizawa walked up to them, barely hearing the hero ask where All Might was. Izuku frowned as 13 held up 3 fingers, causing Izuku's heart to plummet. That probably indicated that Yagi had used up his 3 hours of time and wasn't going to be there for their training. Of course he wasn't. Izuku looked away, unconsciously tuning out the voice of 13. Izuku's sulking was interrupted as all of a sudden part of his quirk went haywire. His heart practically stopped in his chest, and he took an uncontrolled step forward. Sensei, he gasped out, eyes blown wide, directed toward the center of the USJ. "Midoriya?" his teacher asked, frowning down at the boy. Izuku forced his eyes up toward the black-haired man. "Villains. They're coming. I can feel so many." Izuku clutched a hand over his heart, pushing himself forward to grab onto his teacher's arm, trying to convey how serious the situation was. "We need to get everyone out. Now." Aizawa looked down at his student, searching his emerald eyes. He had no chance to respond, though, because it was at that moment that all the lights around the inside of the arena area buzzed out with the sound of popping electricity. Then a black hole seemed to be opening up by the fountain, down the many steps leading down into the main part of the USJ. Aizawa's eyes widened dramatically, and he whirled around, Izuku's hand falling away to come up to his chest over his heart. "Villains," he murmured as so many of them began spilling out of the hole, their auras overwhelmingly intense. "Gather together and don't move," Aizawa yelled, throwing a hand back. 13, protect the students." The man pulled up his yellow goggles, and Izuku gasped, glancing down as the villains continued to spill out. There were so many of them. Oh gods, there were so many. Izuku hadn't even recovered from the shock of them being there in the first place when their teacher's capture weapon flared up around him and his hair lifted up, defying gravity. Izuku recognized this as the man's quirk activating, cementing the fact that these were real weapons, and this was going to be a real fight with real danger. Izuku's hands went around himself, his eyes wide in fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was UA. It was supposed to be impenetrable. Did they only appear here, or around the whole school? Todoroki wondered aloud from next to Izuku, his voice as flat as always, and yeah, that was a very valid question. If it was around the whole school, it was more than likely that they would not be getting any help. More than likely that they would all be perishing right there. Izuku absently tuned Todoroki out for a minute, thinking for himself, only catching the tail end when Aizawa told Kaminari to try to contact the rest of the school. Izuku inhaled sharply as Aizawa leaned forward, preparing to jump into the fray. The boy knew that this wasn't playing to the Erasure Hero's fighting style and became increasingly worried for his teacher. Izuku knew nothing would stop that man from jumping down there to protect his students, though, so he could do nothing but watch as the man who had been able to talk him down from a panic attack jumped straight into what Izuku was sure was death waiting to happen. Izuku couldn't stop himself from stopping to watch his teacher fight as the rest of the students ran in the opposite direction, toward the exit. Everything in his body was screaming at him to jump down, to help. He couldn't just leave. Aizawa had been the first teacher in Izuku's life who treated him like a human being, the first teacher who had cared about his health in any way. He had been the first person, aside from Yagi, who had seen Izuku have a panic attack and not immediately begin treating the boy like he was broken. Izuku was not going to leave him alone. He didn't get a chance to go help. He took one step forward and then was abruptly falling, wind howling past his ears, his stomach in his throat. He slammed into water painfully, sinking far. Panic clawed its way forward, but Izuku fought back, turning upward and struggling to the surface. He flashed to the side, though, when he saw an aura on the edge of his vision, and his eyes widened, burning in the water at the sight of some sort of shark person coming at him, a huge jaw, sharp teeth aiming right for him. Izuku called one for all up, and green lightning immediately lit up the water around him, even as his own panic almost caused him to release the quirk. Right before the shark person reached him, though, something wrapped around his waist and forcibly yanked him upward. Izuku yelped as soon as he broke free of the water and fell onto a hard surface. He coughed, sitting up and turning to find Asui dropping the grape-looking kid on the ground, with a disgusted look on her face. He still hadn't learned that one's name yet, despite having been careful to learn as many names as possible and commit them to memory. Izuku moved to lean over the side of the boat they were on, watching as the villains moved forward to circle around them. He was breathing evenly now, a strange sort of calm settling over him. His body was relaxing, and his brain was chugging on without panic or fear impeding it. Izuku didn't understand why or how his brain was actually working for once, but he wasn't going to question it at the moment. He turned, eyes narrowed, as he considered their options. He looked at Asui. "Quirk?" he asked, and she quickly labeled off everything she could do while he nodded. He turned to the great boy who introduced himself as Mineta, and told him he literally had sticky balls on his head. Both Asui and Izuku stared, and he began screaming. Izuku looked away, ignoring him. He turned back to the villains for a moment, fingers twitching at his sides. Asui watched him without interruption. She could see a plan forming behind those eyes, even if she didn't know him very well yet. "Okay," the green-haired boy said, turning to face her, still ignoring Mineta. "Here's the plan." It was less than a minute later that Izuku was using one for all to leap into the air, grateful that he had such an okay grasp of the quirk already. "Hey, asshats!" he screamed, getting their attention. "Are you all really so weak that you need to attack a bunch of children?" They roared, all of them moving toward him. He grinned. Bullies were so easy to manipulate. Izuku was starting his arc back down from his jump when he deemed that the villains were in position. He put the pointer finger and thumb together on his right hand and just flicked. A massive burst of power erupted from his flick, creating a huge whirlpool almost, the energy forcing Izuku back up. Sue's tongue wrapped around his middle and pulled him up as Mineta actually did something useful, throwing his hairballs into the whirlpool that Izuku had created, so that the villains that had been drawn into it would be stuck together. They landed in the shallow end of the water, as behind them, the villains that were still conscious struggled to pull themselves apart. They reached the edge of the water and debated what would be best to do. Izuku was frowning deeply, glancing back and forth between the exit and the plaza, as Sue noted that Aizawa had drawn just about all the villains to that area. "I am sure that Aizawa's overexerted himself," Izuku said, his voice low, angry. "He's just not meant for this type of fighting." Mineta gasped. Izuku continued. "Realistically, he's in a lot of danger." "You're not suggesting," Sue began. "I am." Izuku squared his shoulders. "Just me. My quirk can allow me to store anything, even people. You saw what I did on that first day with Kachan." "I saw your nose gush blood like a water hose," Sue retorted dryly, and Izuku looked away with a sigh. "I'll wait for an opening, just to do something small to lighten his load," Izuku answered. He would not be dissuaded. Izuku looked up from Sue just in time to catch sight of the villain covered in hands charge Aizawa, his aura black with toxic purple swirling throughout. Izuku watched with growing horror as the villain's hand closed around his teacher's elbow, and it began disintegrating. Aizawa quickly leaped back into action, knocking the hand villain away and kicking and punching the other villains that were surrounding him. Izuku could see that Aizawa was reaching the end of his stamina, stopping to catch his breath, his hair falling down more often. It was in one of those moments of distraction, when that thing that Izuku suddenly realized didn't have an aura, charged the erasure hero and grabbed him, slamming him into the ground, again and again. It was at that point that Izuku's mind was made up for him, his body throwing itself forward, months and months of training, and the fear of his teacher being killed driving him. The portal guy was still distracted, at the top of the steps, and nothing stopped Izuku from sprinting forward. One for all powering his legs, he was a blur. He kept going, pushing harder. Aizawa was going to die if he didn't. May already be dead with the way that thing was slamming his skull into the hard ground, with how much blood was already covering the ground. Izuku had gone through a lot in his meager 16 years. He had been scared before. Oh, he had been scared before, but never, in his entire life, had he experienced such raw terror as he did when he saw that thing getting ready to kill Aizawa. Izuku whizzed by, throwing out a hand at the last second and slapping the beast in the same arm that was clutching his teacher's arm, ready to snap it with all 5 fingers. The noise that tore the monster from the face of the earth sounded like a building being ripped in half. Izuku slid to a stop, panting, not letting either Aizawa or the hand villain leave his vision. Aizawa had turned his head as much as he could and was looking at Izuku in utter horror. Izuku gave him the shakiest, weakest smile in the world, but it was the best he could offer. "What did you do to my Nomu?" The hand man screeched, sounding much like a child that had had their toy taken away. And that was when the pain hit, and Izuku fought back a scream, his teeth slamming together hard enough to almost bite through his tongue. It was bad. It was really, really bad. And while Izuku could still think, he grabbed a syringe from the pocket of his bracer and injected himself in the leg. He knew it wouldn't last long. He had to take advantage of what time he had. The hand villain was angry, already charging him. Izuku threw a punch with his left arm, as soon as he was within range, but the man ducked under it, reaching for Izuku's right arm. Izuku panicked, reeling backward, but he was too slow. He managed to get his wrist far enough away, but the villain reached out and grasped his index finger, and it crumbled fast, turning to dust, leaving only air behind where his finger should be. The villain reached forward again, and in his shock, Izuku was too slow, his hand closing round Izuku's other wrist this time. Izuku was shaking with panic, preparing for the pain. Nothing happened. The hand villain whirled, screaming incoherently at Aizawa from where he was still lying on the ground, looking at the hand villain, his quirk activated. Izuku took advantage of the pause and slammed his foot up, powered by One for All. It crashed into the side of the hand villain's head, and he went flying, being absorbed by another portal before he slammed into a rock. Izuku fell to his knees, struggling not to scream or hyperventilate or both. He cradled his right hand with his left, the pain hitting him. Blood was pouring from his nose, and the place where his finger had been was oozing blood. Izuku could see the bone before his left hand closed around it. The pain in his head was growing to be too much. His eyeballs felt like they were going to collapse in on themselves, and he could barely breathe with all the blood rushing down his throat and out his nose. It felt like that Nomu thing was literally in his brain, tearing it to pieces. Izuku's shaking left hand released the right and fumbled with the pouch yet again, and he grabbed the syringe, pounding it into his leg. He choked, not even feeling the sting of the needle with everything else going on. He tossed the needle aside, the pain abating just enough for him to think. The hand villain seemed to have finished his conversation with the portal guy because they were looking at Izuku now as he forced himself to stand up, unable to keep himself from swaying. Izuku did not think he could keep himself conscious much longer. When he finally met the eyes of the hand villain through his own tunnel vision, Izuku realized that he could actually see his face. That gross hand was gone, and the portal guy seemed to be trying to calm him down as the hand villain scratched his neck violently. Izuku recognized that as a different type of self-soothing technique. Mentally unstable, Izuku realized, just like him. He could work with that. "You seem to have lost your hand, handyman," Izuku rasped as loudly as he could manage. The villain immediately lost control at that, breaking free of the warp villain, lurching forward toward Izuku, who tensed, ready to lay all 5 fingers of his left hand on him and make him join the Nomu, tearing Izuku's mind apart. But it was then that the entirety of the USJ vibrated, with the force of the doors exploding inward. And then there was All Might, in his muscular form, with something other than a smile on his face for the first time Izuku had ever seen from him in that form. "Oh, thank fuck," Izuku gasped out, dropping to his knees, his legs sprawling on either side of him. "We don't stand a chance without Nomu," he heard the warp guy say before he was suddenly gone, taking Handyman with him. Then, all of a sudden, Yagi was in front of him, grasping his shoulders. "Yagi," he gasped, blood dripping from his mouth, both from his bitten tongue and from the blood draining down his throat. "Izuku." Yagi's voice was tortured, his face expressing a mixture of horrified emotions. "What's in your mindscape? What's happening?" Izuku's eyes rolled, and he partially sagged against his mentor, a wave of pain tearing at him. He gagged, spitting up blood. He fumbled at his bracer again, cursing, but his hand was shaking too much to grip the syringe. "Help, please," he choked out, and All Might looked down to see what he was trying to do. "How many have you already used?" Yagi looked scared. He looked desperate, and seeing both those faces on All Might of all people really unsettled Izuku. "Just do it," he gritted out. "I can't pass out. I can't let go." His teeth were chattering from the pain. Yagi must have sensed the importance because he did as Izuku asked, and the boy gasped, slumping. His whole body was shaking so badly that it looked like he was practically seizing. "Help, Aizawa." Yagi looked back where Aizawa was trying to push himself up, less injured than if the Nomu had continued annihilating him, but still quite hurt, his head bleeding rapidly, and his injured arm barely working. "You'll be okay for a minute," Yagi said. Izuku was watching Yagi, his vision colorless and narrow. "Yagi," Izuku choked out, and Yagi looked back at him. "My head." The boy frowned, trying to swallow, to convey what was going on. Yagi gripped his shoulders tighter, keeping him from falling, feeling so useless. "What is it, my boy? What are you hiding in there?" "It's a monster. It's strong enough to kill you," he said, tears streaming from his eyes. Yagi's eyes widened even further in utter horror, and Izuku reached up to touch his face, and yeah, those weren't tears. He was bleeding from his eyes. His gaze went back to Yagi's, his heart seizing. The #1 hero was speechless. Another," Izuku forced out, and Yagi immediately knew what he was asking for. "No!" Yagi almost yelled in raw terror. That was when the rest of the heroes arrived. Yagi looked to Aizawa, relieved to see that Present Mike was immediately at Aizawa's side, some of Ectoplasm's clones joining them. Others were sprinting over to where he was supporting young Izuku from collapsing, his small frame quaking beneath his hands. Yagi didn't know what type of monster Izuku was hiding from him, but Izuku knew Yagi. He was aware of his abilities and his limitations. Yagi knew this, so when Izuku said this thing could kill him, he believed it, however unlikely it seemed. Midnight and several others reached them, and Izuku's head whipped up when he saw the R-rated hero. "Midnight!" His eyes were desperate, and he looked over at Yagi, silently begging him to figure out what he wanted and relay it to the hero. Yagi did know what he was trying to say. He has a villain in his mindscape. He needs to bring it out, or... Yagi glanced at his successor, at the blood running from his eyes in steady streams, pouring down his nose, running from his ears. He looked back at Midnight, clearing his throat. He needs to bring it out, but he won't. He says it's powerful enough to kill me. Midnight's eyes flashed, processing. A second passed, and then she nodded, standing. Understood. Her left hand went to the sleeve of her opposite arm, preparing to pull it up and blast whatever villain this was in the face with her strongest mist. Yagi looked down at the boy, whose eyes were half-lidded, barely remaining open. Release the villain now, Izuku. The heroes have it covered. Let go. Izuku made a wet, choking sound in the back of his throat and slid his eyes away from Yagi, with what looked like great difficulty. He then lifted his hand, which Yagi only just noticed was missing an entire finger. A rough scream broke free of the boy, and then all of a sudden a hulking beast was in front of them, and Midnight's mist was immediately around its head in a cloud. It collapsed, with a thump that shook the ground. Heart stuttering, Yagi looked at Izuku. The boy's eyes were closed, and he was no longer shaking. Yagi felt his heart stop, and he leaned forward, reigning in hysteria. He put a hand on the boy's chest, held it there. He's not breathing. Next to him, Midnight gasped, and a little farther away, where Present Mike was half carrying, half dragging the barely conscious Aizawa. He heard the Erasure hero give a soft, "No," before collapsing the rest of the way. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 6 of State of Mind. Chapter 7 will be up next. I'm desperately eager to hear what you all thought of this chapter. I thought it was such a cool USJ chapter. The author did a really nice job describing this one. Izuku got pretty roughed up in this one as well, but at least Aizawa didn't get as many injuries this time. Let me know what you all thought of this one, though. Please drop your comments below, and as always, thank you so much for listening.